up, gents. Step up and look at fine stock. Strong back, young, can work dawn to midnight. $30.
The sun over Dry Creek never rose so much as it leaned a slow tilt of white heat that pressed the breath out of men and horses. By mid-morning, the town wore a coat of powder, wind-blown dust on window ledges, flour on boots, ash on tongues. Daniel Carter rode in with his hat pulled low and his thoughts tied tighter than his cinch. He had a list in his pocket that said, rope, salt, sugar nails, lamp oil. The list was a prayer to the ordinary, and he trusted the ordinary the way he trusted an old horse, by the sound of it breathing. He swung down at the hitch rail outside Kincaid's General and let his gelding do the talking with a deep, wet snort. Inside the store, the smell was a dry pantry of the West tobacco leather beans and pine barrels, swollen with heat. Daniel nodded to Mrs. Kincaid, said as few words as necessary, and put his attention on twine and shovel heads. The less a man said, the less the world could take from him. That was his way since the winter fever. He had his palm on a coil of manila when a voice from the street cut through the hum of trade. It carried a metallic edge, the kind a man gets from barking orders more than speaking truth. Step up, gents. Step up and look at fine stock. Strong back, young, can work dawn to midnight. The coil turned gritty in Daniel's hand. He set it down and stepped out into the Sunday. Dust had made a soft ring in the road where a little crowd pressed together, half the town, it seemed, drawn by the cruelty that lives under boredom like a snake under a porch. An officer in travel-worn uniform stood on the freight platform. His sleeves rolled, and his jaw set the way a cheap lock sits. Beside him, two troopers held the tail of a length of rope. On the rope's other end stood a woman. She was straight as a fence-post, chin, lifted hands bound in front. Her hair, black as wet obsidian, fell in a loose braid that had gathered the day's dust and still refused to turn dull. Copper-brown skin, a mouth that kept its own counsel. The torn calico on her shoulder had dried in stiff ridges from old rain. When the shouted laughter from the crowd rose, she stared beyond everyone's faces to a horizon only she could see. Apache, someone behind. Daniel breathed half curiosity, half fear. The officer's voice crackled again. By order of the territorial, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Men knew the story they wanted to hear, and the price they wanted to pay for it. The officer let the rope creak in his hand and showed the woman as you'd show a mule turning her like a wheel. Daniel felt something pull in his chest. It was not pity. Pity looks down and tries to feel tall. It was memory, his own wife's hand light as sparrow bone in his, and a small boy's breath rattling like corn husks in a kettle. It was the sound of a fever you cannot fight, and the silence afterward which you also cannot fight. He had learned since then that grief becomes anger if you don't keep it watered with kindness. He had also learned he had less kindness left than he wanted. $20, the officer called. She is worth more, but I am a reasonable man. Hear me, reasonable. A cowhand with whiskey eyes tossed a coin high enough to glint and said something raw. Laughter came in small splashes. Daniel's throat hurt like he'd swallowed sand. He did not plan to speak. The word rose anyway, round and clear. 30. The laughter stopped. Heads turned. The officer blinked once like a lizard in the Sunday. Do I hear 35? No one answered. The wind did rubbing grit along the platform boards. 40, Daniel said, because silence sometimes needs a handrail. Sold, the officer snapped, already stepping down, already pocketing something that looked like relief. What followed had a clumsy, dreamlike quality paper scrawled with ink that made a law out of theft, a length of rope offered to his hand, that he did not take a murmur that had the slow boil of judgment. He cut the knot at the woman's wrists with his own pocket knife, the blade, nicking the rope in 2 breaths. For the first time, she looked at him directly. Her eyes had a dark sheen like river stone not yet dry. There was nothing helpless in them, nothing pleading. He felt oddly seen, as if she had found a mark on his soul and was weighing it quietly. You'll want a receipt, the officer said. His grin showed a gold crown. For the preacher, should you have a mind for Daniel, folded the paper once and put it into his vest. No, he lifted the woman up onto his horse, careful, steady, not touching her more than the lift required, and mounted behind, leaving space that was both decency and acknowledgement she belonged to no hand. As they moved, the crowd parted with the sound of dry grass being dragged across a yard. A woman on the boardwalk made a tight noise in her throat. Someone spat. Dust got into everything. They rode the first mile in a silence held together by hoofbeats. The country beyond Dry Creek opened like a worn palm ridges, the color of old coin greasewood bristling in patches, the line of the mountains standing in the far like tired men who keep standing because they always have. The horse knew the way and chose the easiest angle across a wash, choked with pale stones. After a while he said, "My place isn't far." He did not recognize his own voice. It sounded like it had been put away too long and came out creased. She didn't answer. The afternoon gathered heat into itself, and then let it go with the first mercy of shade from a line of cottonwoods where a trickle of water made its whispering argument with the dust. He felt the small change in her spine when the air turned cooler, nothing so bold as a lean back, just a soft easing, as if the body, despite the mind, wanted to trust for a breath. "Do you want water?" he asked when they crossed the shallow creek. He slid down, filled his hat, and offered it up like a sacrament. She cupped with her bound wrists and drank, eyes never quite leaving his face. When he went to cut the last loop of thin jute at her hands, he paused and lifted the knife so she could see the blade. He wanted no motion to surprise her. She watched him, nodded once. The fibers parted with a sound that was too loud in the hush. When they reached his land, the light was going gold and long, so that the cloud edges turned to fire at the edges. The house showed its bones honestly, one room, a porch that leaned just so, a chair that had learned his weight, a short barn, a fence he meant to fix. He helped her down, and the moment her bare feet touched his yard, a small wind came up that smelled of old hay and iron stove smoke. Home is never a place so much as a set of small smells, he thought. You can carry it, but you cannot own it. You can rest inside, he said, opening the door with a palm that trembled more than his voice. "I'll be outside if you'd rather." She stepped in and took the whole of it, the way water takes a cup without judgment, filling the shape that exists. The table was scarred but scrubbed. The bed had a clean quilt. The stove clicked softly as a coal fell in on itself. She set her freed hands on the sill and watched the last heat wash the small corral. He put water to the boil and took down beans and a handful of dried meat he'd put by. When he set the tin bowl on the table, she looked at it with an attention that was a kind of grace, then ate with neat, deliberate motions that wasted nothing. He did not realize he was holding his breath until he had to cough into his fist. Why, she asked, when the bowls were empty and the kettle had a new voice. Her English was plain, accented, careful. She did not waste words on pleasantry. "Why did you give them money?" He stared at his hands. They were rope-scarred, nail-bed, grimy, older than his years. He had learned to answer questions straight. "Because I couldn't let them do what they were doing," he said. Not with all those eyes watching and nobody stopping it. She considered that as a person considers a trail where it rises, where it narrows, whether it leads anywhere you'd want to go. "You bought me," she said, not accusing, not grateful, simply marking the thing that had been said in town. "No," he answered, and the word surprised him with its weight. "I paid to end something. That's all I know how to say." A little wind slipped through the chinking and ran its fingers along the shelf, where a small whittled horse stood with its head turned. She saw it, and the corner of her mouth moved not quite a smile. After a long beat, she said, "Ayanna." He looked up. "Ayanna," he repeated the name, low and round, reverent as water. It settled into the room. He offered the bed and took the chair by the door. He had slept there more nights than in the bed since the bad winter habit finding the post where it could tie. The fire's light climbed the wall in slow red hands and made the shadow of her braid long. At some hour between one quiet and the next, the house stopped being a shell and became a place with two heartbeats. He did not sleep so much as listen to the steady rise and fall of breath that was not his own, and listening felt a ridge inside him begin to soften. At dawn, a delicate coolness lay over the ground, the kind that lasts only while the birds clear their throats. Daniel rose to the sound of something like straw whispering. He stepped out onto the porch and found Ayanna by the small barn with her feet almost silent in the dust. She had found the hay fork and was giving the horse a scatter of flakes, her movements sure. She lifted her hand to the animal's neck and rubbed in a slow circle until it blew a quiet breath and lowered its head. The light found her hair and set small sparks on the loose strands. "You don't have to work," he said, and heard, in his own words, the clumsiness of a man who wanted to be kind and didn't know the right measurement. She looked at him with an expression that was neither soft nor sharp, only steady. "I know," she said. "I am not a stone." They mended a section of fence as the sun made up its mind. He handed her nails and held the board. She swung the hammer with cleaner rhythm than most men he'd hired, not hard so much as exact. A blue fly worried the edge of a knot. The horse in the corral watched with one ear turned. The quiet between them had shape to it now, like shade under a mesquite, chosen, not empty. When he brought out an old calico dress, folded in the deep of a chest, and held it with both hands, as if it were what it was, a piece of his former life, he had not yet learned how to hold. Ayanna took it, thumbed the hem, and asked, "Your wife?" He nodded. The word stuck in his throat like a thorn. "Mary." "I will keep it safe," she said. It was not the answer he expected, and it was exactly the right one. He felt a loosening in his ribs. That evening the sky leaned low with a soft-bellied storm, the kind that smells like iron and forgiveness. They stood on the porch and let cool, merest rain lay its damp on their arms. She lifted both palms to it and closed her eyes. He watched the way the first drops turned the dust dark and then darker, until the earth gave off a breath like a tired animal drinking. Inside later she sat by the hearth with her hair undone, drawing a bone comb through it in patient strokes. He knew how a man's stare could hurt. He looked instead at the fire and spoke as one does to flames, not expecting an answer. "You said what we did, what I did, doesn't make you mine. I know. Freedom with a price is not freedom," she said, not unkindly. "But you gave me some air." He nodded. "Then, you can stay tonight and tomorrow if you wish, and the day after if that's what you choose. Or, I'll take you anywhere you name." She looked at him fully then. In her eyes he saw not gratitude, but measuring of how much a solitary man could keep his word, of whether his silence had room in it for another voice. After a long time she said, "You carry much quiet." There was something almost like mercy in the way she said it. Quiet can be heavy. He laughed, once a low, rusty sound. "I always thought it was lighter than talk." "Sometimes," she answered. "Sometimes not." When sleep took the house again, the storm had blown past and left the world scrubbed and smelling of mesquite and wet dirt. Daniel lay in the chair the quilt he hadn't used in months, folded over his legs, and realized that the day had not broken him, though it had bent him into a new shape. He thought of the paper in his vest, and what law thinks it proves, and he thought of the cut rope on the floor by the door. The rope was the truer document. Near dawn, as the sky went the pale color of a tin cup, he woke to a weightless feeling he could not name at first. Then he heard it, the small domestic sounds of a life not lived alone. Water poured. A pot set gentle on iron. A breath. He closed his eyes again and let those sounds move through him like a stream through stones. Grief, he understood, suddenly is not a hole to be filled, but a river to be joined by other rivers, until all that's left is the sound of moving. When he opened the door, the morning had edges of silver. Ayanna stood by the well, hauling a bucket with a rhythm that matched the creak of the old pulley. She did not turn when she said, "There is work. The land asks for us." "Yes," he said, and the word had a warmth in it he had not felt in years. He stepped into the day that was not the same as any day before it, and picked up the pail she had set down for him. The handle bit his palm with its familiar bite. Out in the small field, under a sky bigger than anything a man can hold, two figures moved in the same weather, and the dust that rose behind their boots did not seem for once like something the wind alone would claim. The next morning broke quiet and wide. The storm had rinsed the land clean, leaving a smell of wet cedar and smoke from last night's fire. Daniel stood on the porch with his coffee tin warm in his hands and watched the valley breathe itself back to life. Far off, a hawk circled. Closer, the horses moved slow through the pen hooves, pressing the mud, with a sound that felt older than speech. Ayanna was already outside. She wore the faded calico dress he'd given her, the one that once belonged to Mary. Somehow it fit her without needing to. The cloth caught the wind and shaped itself around her like memory learning how to live again. She was cutting small weeds out of the field with a short knife, her motions sharp and certain. "You don't rest much," Daniel said. She looked over her shoulder. "The earth wakes early." He smiled into his coffee, the steam curling like words he didn't know how to say. For years, he'd lived by the rhythm of livestock, the kind of life that leaves you talking to fences because they don't argue back. Now, every sound carried weight. The soft rip of weeds, the click of her blade, the occasional lift of her voice, when she hummed something that sounded like wind over rocks. By midday, the sun had turned the soil dry again. They worked without hurry, side by side. Daniel fixed the pump handle while Ayanna patched a hole in the water trough using strips of old leather. When she finished, she tested the patch, with her palm knotted once, and said, "It will hold." "You know tools," he said. "My father made bows," she answered. "And roofs. You learn what your hands can do when no one else will build for you." Her tone wasn't bitter. It was as flat and true as the horizon. Daniel wanted to ask more, but stopped himself. He'd learned that silence between them wasn't emptiness, it was breathing space. That evening after supper, he took his guitar from the wall. The wood was cracked from years of neglect, strings dull, but he turned the pegs and coaxed a tune from it. Ayanna sat across the room, brushing her hair by the fire. "You play?" she asked softly. "Not well," he admitted, "but enough to remember." He began a slow melody, one his wife used to hum when the nights got long and the wind cried through the cracks. The notes wandered unsure at first, then settled. Ayanna listened, eyes steady on the fire, her fingers pausing mid-stroke through her hair. When the song ended, she said, "That song has no beginning." Daniel looked up. "What do you mean it starts?" "Like it was already here," she said. "Like the wind." He nodded, not sure how to answer. Outside, the rain barrels dripped the last of the storm's gift. He leaned the guitar against the wall and poured water into 2 cups. "You've been here only 2 nights," he said quietly. "It feels longer." Ayanna wrapped her hands around the tin cup. "The land remembers fast," she said. "It takes what is given." He studied her face, how the firelight shifted across her cheekbones, the faint scar near her temple, the calm set of her jaw. "I meant," he said, "it doesn't feel empty anymore." She looked at him then. The pause that followed felt alive, full of unspoken things. Finally, she said, "Empty places are honest, but they shouldn't stay that way forever." The words landed deep. Daniel thought of all the nights he'd sat by this same fire, listening to nothing but the wind. Now that same wind sounded different, as if it had learned her voice. The following day he rode into town. The road shimmered with heat, the air full of that faint humming that comes before noon. When he reached the general store, the same people who had whispered at the auction looked up. Some nodded, some didn't. Daniel said little, bought feed, sugar, and nails, then turned his horse homeward. Halfway back he saw a small coyote by the ridge, ribs thin as bowstrings, watching him with yellow patience. He threw it a piece of jerky. It sniffed, hesitated, and finally took it. "We're all hungry for something," Daniel muttered and kept riding. When he reached the ranch, Ayanna was at the river washing clothes. The sight stopped him. Her sleeves were rolled, her hair tied back, and the hem of her dress dark with water. She looked like part of the land, like the river had claimed her as its reflection. She turned when she heard the horse. "You were gone long," she said. "Town was slow," he replied. "Did you miss me?" Her lips twitched. "No," she said, but her eyes softened. "Only the noise of your boots." He laughed under his breath. It had been years since laughter felt natural in his mouth. They worked together to hang the clothes, each piece, snapping lightly in the wind. The day waned into gold, then amber. Birds gathered on the fence wire, their calls thin and clear. "You ever think of leaving?" he asked suddenly. Ayanna tied a sheet to the line and didn't look up. "Leaving where?" Anywhere, he said. The reservation, maybe? South. Somewhere with your people. She finished the knot before answering. I think of them every day, she said. But the dead don't live anywhere. They live inside what we remember. She paused. You remember you're dead too, he swallowed. Yes. Then we both stay with ghosts, she said quietly. Only yours have walls around them. He had no answer to that, but her words followed him long after the sun fell. That night, the wind came again, not harsh, just restless. Daniel sat on the porch, sharpening his knife. Ayanna joined him, wrapping a shawl over her shoulders. The sky above them spread wide and black, the stars white and distant, as truths people stopped telling. You think they'll talk, she asked after a while. Who people in town? About us. They already did, and he sheathed the knife, set it aside. And the land's still here. That's what matters. Ayanna looked toward the dark horizon. My mother said the land listens to those who walk it with clean hearts. Then we'll give it something worth hearing, Daniel said. She turned to him, surprised by the ease in his voice. For a heartbeat, something like warmth flickered between them, quiet, tentative, alive. The moon climbed higher, throwing silver over the plain. Daniel's hand brushed the porch rail close enough to feel the heat that lingered from the day. Beside him, Ayanna's breathing was steady. Neither moved to break the silence. When at last she spoke, her voice was low, like the last note of a song. Maybe freedom is not walking away. Maybe it's staying and not being afraid. Daniel looked at her. Then you're free here. She didn't answer, but she smiled, a small, uncertain thing that felt stronger than any vow. The stars burned on. The house behind them glowed with firelight, and for the first time in years, Daniel Carter knew what it was to belong to the land, to the quiet, and maybe, just maybe, to someone who had chosen to stay. The next days folded into each other like pages gone soft at the edges. Sunrise, work, small talk, the smell of dust after watering. Daniel and Ayanna found a rhythm without needing to name it. It was a rhythm of movement more than words, the scrape of hoe against soil, the dull ring of a hammer fixing a fence rail, the soft thump of a pail set down near the well. Daniel noticed that when Ayanna worked, the world around her seemed to obey her calm. Horses that shied from him stood still under her touch. Chickens followed her as if she carried some invisible grain. Even the wind moved differently around her. Less a force, more a companion. One morning, as she scattered feed near the coop, he said, "You've got the land listening to you already." Ayanna straightened, brushing dust from her hands. "The land doesn't listen," she said. "It remembers. If you treat it right, it forgives slow but sure." He nodded. "Maybe people are the same." She looked at him for a long second before replying, "No, people forget too fast." He thought of the townsfolk's faces that day at the auction, their smirks, their coins flashing like flies in the sun, and couldn't argue. By afternoon, the heat grew thick enough to slow everything down. Daniel worked shirtless near the corral, sweat streaking his back as he fixed a loose hinge. Ayanna came with a pail of water and set it beside him. "You'll cook yourself," she said. "Old hide, like mine's hard to burn." She raised an eyebrow, her mouth curving just slightly. Even dry land burns when lightning finds it. He laughed, wiping his hands on his jeans before taking the cup she offered. Her words stayed with him as he drank. When he looked up, she was studying him not with shyness or boldness, but with the calm curiosity of someone trying to understand what keeps another person standing. "You work like you're paying a debt," she said finally. Daniel's hand froze around the tin cup. "Maybe I am." To who he didn't answer. But later, when he was alone in the barn, mending a saddle strap, her question kept whispering. To who the truth rose quiet and old to those he couldn't save. His wife, his boy, the part of himself that had stopped believing there was more to life than survival. That night, a coyote howled close, its voice long and lonely. Daniel stepped outside with his rifle out of habit, but Ayanna was already on the porch, her shawl wrapped tight. "They're talking," she said, tilting her head toward the hills. "What do they say that they remember?" He lowered the rifle. "You understand them." She smiled faintly. "I understand what silence tries to say." Daniel looked at her, the moonlight cutting silver through her hair. Something in him eased, the way a rope sighs when the weight is lifted. "Come sit," she said softly. You look like a man who hasn't rested in years." He did. They sat side by side, the boards creaking under their combined weight. The smell of sage drifted up from the field. For a long time neither spoke. The night pressed close, but not unkind. Ayanna broke the silence first. "I used to think peace was a place, somewhere beyond pain, and now I think peace is a person who listens without wanting to fix you." Daniel turned the thought over in his mind. "You've seen too much to be young," he said. She gave a small shrug. Pain teaches fast. When she stood to go inside, she paused at the doorway. "You should stop carrying ghosts that don't belong to you." He frowned. "What do you mean, your wife and child? They live in the wind now. You keep them in your silence, but they were meant to rest." Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it. He wanted to say, "Silence is all I have left of them," but the words stayed. He only nodded. The next morning, Ayanna was gone from the cabin. Panic flickered through him like lightning through dry brush.
30!
He searched the barn, the fields, then followed faint footprints toward the river. He found her there, standing knee-deep in the cold water arms, lifted slightly, as if speaking to something unseen. The sun had just risen, painting her silhouette in gold. Daniel watched without calling her name. He felt like an intruder on something sacred. When she turned, her eyes caught the light and softened when they saw him. "I come here to remember my people," she said. "This river sounds like the one that ran near our village. My father said water carries stories if you listen long enough." Daniel stepped closer, boots sinking in mud. "What story do you hear now?" She smiled sadly. "A new one. I don't know the ending yet." "Maybe you don't need to," he said. Ayanna looked up, the sun climbing behind her. "You speak like a man who's afraid to hope." He shook his head. "I speak like a man who forgot how." The river shimmered between them, cold and alive. For a moment he thought she would walk away into that light and disappear, carried downstream with the rest of her memories. Instead, she stepped toward him and said quietly, "Then remember again." She walked past him toward the house, leaving small wet prints in the dust. Daniel followed his chest tight with something that wasn't quite pain anymore. That evening, clouds built again over the hills. The air turned heavy, smelling of copper and rain. They brought the animals into shelter, tying the barn doors tight. As thunder rolled, Ayanna stood in the doorway, her hair loose, eyes on the horizon. "You should come inside," Daniel said. She didn't move. "Storms don't scare me." "I didn't say they should," he replied, stepping beside her. "But they don't ask permission either." The wind rose, sweeping dust in wild spirals. Ayanna faced it, her expression calm. "In my tribe," she said, "we believe storms are old spirits washing the world clean. If they find you unafraid, they pass over you." "Then I'll stand with you," Daniel said quietly. She turned to him, surprise flickering in her eyes, then nodded. "Then we both stand." Lightning split the sky. For a moment everything was white. Her face, his hat, the rain breaking like glass. Then the world went dark again, full of sound and breath, and the wild scent of earth opening to receive what it needed. When the thunder eased, Daniel looked at her and realized he was no longer thinking of the woman he had bought to save. He was thinking of the woman who had saved him from the silence. Later, inside by the fading fire, Ayanna said, "Tomorrow the land will be soft. We should plant something." He glanced at her, surprised. "What would you plant?" "Corn. My mother said it keeps families together." He nodded slowly. "Then we'll plant it." She smiled, not wide, just enough to light the corners of her eyes. "Good," she said. "The earth should see us working side by side." Outside, rain still fell gentle, now washing the last dust from the window glass. Inside, Daniel Carter sat across from Ayanna, the fire between them, small but steady. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. The storm had done what storms were meant to do, it had broken something open and left behind the clean silence where life could begin again. Morning came, silver and quiet, the kind of calm that settles after the land has been wrung out by storm. The sky was still heavy, but the air carried a clean sweetness. Daniel woke to the smell of damp earth and the sound of Ayanna moving near the door, bare feet soft on the boards, her voice low, as she hummed an old melody that didn't belong to any words he knew. She was already outside when he rose. In the soft light, he saw her crouched near the small patch of ground beside the barn, a wooden bowl of seeds in her lap. Her hands worked carefully, each movement measured deliberate. "You started without me," he said, stepping off the porch. Ayanna didn't look up. "You move slow in the morning." He smiled faintly. "Coffee's worth waking for. Soil can wait." She tilted her head, still focused on her work. Soil waits for no one. It remembers who tends it first. Daniel knelt beside her, feeling the cool moisture in the ground. "What kind of seeds, corn?" she said simply. "From my mother's pouch. I've carried them a long time." He looked at the small kernels resting in her palm amber, almost glowing in the light. "They've traveled far." "So have I," she replied, planting the first one. He followed her lead, pressing each seed gently into the dark soil. The work was silent, rhythmic. For a while the only sounds were the scrape of their hands, the breath of wind through the grass, and the call of a meadowlark somewhere beyond the ridge. When they finished, Ayanna stood brushing dirt from her palms. "Now we wait," she said. "For rain, for time," she answered. Daniel watched her walk toward the well to draw water. He thought about how easily she moved through the space that once felt too wide for him, how she had filled the quiet without crowding it. By noon, the sun came out again, bright but gentle. Daniel hitched the wagon and rode into town for supplies. The trail shimmered with heat, the desert scent rising dust and sage, and the faint sweetness of blooming cactus. When he rode home, the air carried a faint rumble from the far hills, a reminder that storms never go too far. They just rest. Ayanna was waiting by the corral when he returned. "You were gone long," she said. "Town's slower than it used to be," he replied, unloading the sacks. She studied his face, catching what he didn't say. "They still talk." He nodded. "They will. But talk dies faster than grass grows." She gave a small smile. "Grass lives because it bends. People should learn from it." Daniel laughed quietly. "You always sound like you've been here longer than the rest of us." "I listen better," she said simply. That evening the world turned gold again. They sat on the porch watching the sky shift from copper to violet. The air was still holding the weight of something unspoken. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Daniel asked suddenly. Ayanna was quiet for a moment. "Leaving means going back. There's nothing left behind me. What about forward?" She looked out at the field where they had planted the corn. "Forward is what we make." Her words sank deep. Daniel thought about how much of his life had been spent waiting for the rain to come for grief, to fade for something to mean enough to stay. Now, sitting beside her, he realized he wasn't waiting anymore. Later that night, Ayanna sat by the fire, weaving something from strands of horsehair and dried grass. Daniel watched her fingers move steady and sure. "What's that?" he asked. "A bracelet," she said. "For luck." He smiled. "You think I need it?" She didn't look up. Everyone who's been alone too long needs a little luck. When she finished, she handed it to him. "For you," she said. Daniel turned it over in his hands. The weave was simple but strong. "It's beautiful," he said. "Why give it to me?" "Because you gave me back my name," she said softly. He looked at her, the firelight flickering in her eyes. He wanted to say something, but words felt too small. He slipped the bracelet around his wrist instead. "Then I'll keep it," he said. "You better," she replied, the faintest smile touching her lips. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He stepped outside, the bracelet warm against his skin. The stars burned sharp and close, and the air smelled of rain that hadn't yet fallen. From inside the cabin came the sound of Ayanna's soft breathing. It blended with the night, the rustle of grass, the low song of a coyote, the whisper of the wind through the fence posts. Daniel looked out over the land. Once it had felt endless, a punishment of distance and silence. Now it felt alive, full of something that asked nothing but respect. He realized then that what he had bought in that dusty town wasn't a person or redemption. It was a chance, a fragile, living thing that could grow if tended right. He turned back toward the house, the faint orange glow of the fire spilling through the cracks. For the first time, he didn't see it as a lonely man's refuge. He saw it as home, and for the first time in years, he whispered a small prayer, not for forgiveness, but for the strength to deserve what he'd been given. The wind carried the sound away into the night, and somewhere beyond the dark hills, the earth answered with silence that felt like peace. The next sunrise came slow and gold, spilling over the hills like honey. The rain from days before had left a thin green blush on the valley, and the air smelled alive again of sage earth and beginnings. Daniel stood outside the cabin, the wooden bracelet cool against his wrist, watching the world stretch into light. Inside, Ayana's voice drifted softly, humming a song he didn't know but already felt he'd always know. He turned when she stepped out. She wore the same calico dress, freshly washed, the fabric pale in the morning. Her hair was loose, the breeze catching strands and sending them across her face. In her hands, she carried a small tin bowl filled with the first shoots of the corn they'd planted days ago. Tiny green blades, fragile but alive. "They've come," she said. Daniel smiled. "Guess the land heard you." "The land hears what's true," she replied, "not what's loud." They stood side by side, looking down at the small life they'd coaxed from the ground. For a long time, neither spoke. It was the kind of silence that felt whole, the kind that doesn't hide pain but accepts it. "You ever think about that day in town?" Daniel asked quietly. Ayana's eyes stayed on the seedlings. "Every day," she said. "It reminds me that mercy can look like madness." He chuckled softly. "Felt like it at the time. You paid to end cruelty," she said, "but you didn't know it would end your loneliness too." He looked at her, caught off guard by the simplicity of her truth. "Maybe I didn't want to know," he said. "Maybe I was afraid to want anything again." Ayana turned to him, the sunlight touching her face. "Then don't be afraid now." That afternoon, Daniel hitched the wagon. "I've got to fetch the preacher from town," he said. Ayana paused in her work. "Why?" He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "Because there's something I want to set right." Her eyes searched his face. "What thing?" He took a deep breath. "You said once that freedom bought isn't real. I believe you. So maybe it's time we both stand where no one can question who you are to me." Ayana's brow furrowed slightly, understanding dawning slow but sure. "You mean?" Daniel nodded, quiet, steady. "If you'll have me." She was silent for a long moment. The wind stirred the edges of her shawl. Then she said softly, "I chose to stay long before you asked." He smiled, and for the first time in years, it reached his eyes. The next morning dawned clear. The preacher arrived just as the sun climbed above the ridge, his small wagon creaking over the damp earth. He stepped down, adjusting his hat, his old eyes warm with understanding. "No crowd," he said lightly. Daniel shook his head. "Just us and the land." Ayana stepped forward, barefoot, her feet pressing the cool dirt. She wore the same white dress she'd mended from Mary's old chest. It wasn't fine or fancy, but under the open sky it looked like it belonged nowhere else. The preacher smiled. "That's all the witness the good Lord needs." He opened his small, worn book and began to speak, his voice low and kind. "Marriage is not ownership," he said, glancing at Daniel, then Ayana. "It's the choice to walk beside, through dust and rain, through loss and peace." The wind moved gently through the grass as he asked, "Do you, Daniel Carter, take this woman to be your wife, to walk with her, to honor her, to protect her freedom?" As your own Daniel's voice was steady. "I do." "And do you, Ayana, take this man to be your husband, to stand beside him, to share his burdens, and to bring peace where silence used to be?" Ayana met Daniel's eyes. "I do," she said, clear and certain. The preacher closed the book with a soft thump. "Then by the promise spoken, and the earth that hears it, I declare you husband and wife." For a long moment no one moved. The wind stilled, the horses in the corral quieted, and even the sun seemed to wait. Daniel reached for Ayana's hand, not to claim it, but to hold it. She didn't hesitate. They stood like that, two lives woven from loss, now bound not by law or word, but by choice. The preacher tipped his hat and rode away down the trail, leaving them alone with the wide world. That evening the land glowed gold. Daniel and Ayana sat on the porch, watching the sun slide behind the hills. She rested her hand on his arm, her fingers light, her touch sure. "You think people will understand?" she asked. He shook his head. "Maybe not, but they'll see we ain't asking permission." Ayana smiled faintly. Good.